Hi everyone, I'm Renee Hiatt. Welcome to my studio and Tutorial Tuesday week 15. Today we're going to talk about a faux flange binding. So this is part of my binding series, and if nothing else, this will get me to get the binding on several of my quilts that have been sitting around. Today I'm going to take you through putting a flange border, a faux flange border, on a quilt. I'm going to put it on my spring bouquet. This was an alternative version that was created for a magazine company, and they had sent me the fabric. The fabric they chose for the binding wasn't to my liking, so when it came back from being photographed, I actually took the binding off and basically carried it around for years in trunk shows without a binding on. So those guilds will be happy to know that I finally got my binding on. And I did it because I put on this faux flange binding. And it turned out great. It really did. It's been a couple of years since I've done it, and I think I'm going to start doing it more often. How you go about doing it is you have a fabric that you select for your flange, which is giving you your pop. And then you have your fabric that you've picked as your binding. We're going to sew those together and then sew them on with a machine. So the faux flange binding is basically all sewn on with your machine. So it is definitely quicker, although you still want to take your time for it to look right. I like it because you still have the poof of a binding that you would have sewn on by hand, because you're not stitching the binding. You're going to actually stitch in the ditch between the flange and the binding. So it still gives you a look that I would say is authentic to a traditional hand-sewn binding. This is a great option for when you have a quilt that's going to be used often and washed often. So this would be a fabulous way to sew on a binding for a child's quilt, or for a utility quilt that you know is going to be washed often. I also like that it gives you the chance to add a little pop. So this border is quite, I would say, flat, right? It's not a floral print, it's more of a tone on tone. And so to add some added interest, I could have gone with a bright pink binding, right, to bring back in that inner border. However, I actually like that I just have a hint of that pink, and I've brought back the same fabric that I used on my border for my binding. So I really think it jazzes something up, but it's also a great use for a utility quilt that's going to get used often. And it's quicker, at least in my case, than sewing on a hand-stitched binding. All right, some of the things, and I'll take you through how I use them in my application of this faux flange binding. Some of the tools that I found useful were, again, my gloves. You saw this back in week 13. Again, I find them invaluable. I also find a stitch in the ditch foot to be a great assistance here, and that has a little guide that comes down the center of your foot, helping you stay on track. The other thing you're going to need is, depending on what fabric you picked for your flange, you are going to want to have thread that matches it or very closely. And then I love my Wonder Clips. You're going to need a good number of them. They come in assorted colors. I'll have a few for sale on my website if you have trouble finding them at your local quilt shop. And I just keep them in a jar versus the container they come in. I just find it's a little easier for me to access. So those are the key tools that I find extremely useful. If you're wondering what's behind me, I actually just finished recording the other day my Timeless with a Twist Block 2. So that is my 13-part series. That's a technique building series to help you improve your skills. So you can join in that series at any point, and even after I've stopped publishing them monthly, and get access to all 13 months lessons. But I've just released the second month, which is actually the third lesson because I give you a lesson on fabric selection. So it's a great opportunity to take your skills to a new level. So if you're interested in that, go to my website, sewonthego.net, and go to my classes and online classes, and you'll see how to sign up for that. So I'm going to get started. Let me take you over to the pressing table to show you how to get started on putting this fabulous, quite easy binding on. Alright, so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to cut our strips. I'm going to go with a pink flange and a blue binding. Therefore, I'm going to cut my flange fabric, which is my peekaboo fabric, a wider strip. That's going to be cut at 2 inches. The flange fabric, the peekaboo, will be cut at 2 inches. I'm then going to cut my binding at 1 3/8. So the binding is cut at 1 3/8. You are going to use the same math that I talked you through to calculate this binding as you did a traditional binding. So basically it is the sum of all 4 sides plus 12 to 15 inches for you to be able to do your corners and piece it together at the end. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to sew together our strips, the same as we would do a traditional binding. So we're going to go ahead and do our cross. I like to draw the line, stitch on the line, cut off, and then press open. You will do the same for your binding piece. So as I did in week 13, I've gone ahead and sewn together my binding strips and my flange strips the same way I sewed together my binding strips in week 13. So I go ahead, once I've stitched it together, I go ahead and cut about 1/4 inch, leaving 1/4 inch. I go ahead and set my seam, and then over my seam stick I go ahead and I press this open. And I'm going to continue doing that for all my strips. Alright, so now I have my 2 long strips, the length that I need for my quilt, which remember I helped you with on the calculations of that on week 12. So if you need to refer back to how to figure out that calculation, you can. So all my seams are attached and pressed open, both on my flange strip, which is the wider strip at 2 inches, and then my thinner strip, which is actually my binding. And I've done the same thing. This was cut at 1 3/8. So now I'm going to attach these 2 strips together, placing them right sides together and stitching them with a 1/4 inch. I am then going to press it towards the smaller strip, my binding, but I'll show you that when I get there. Let me go sew this. Alright, so I've gone ahead and I've stitched my binding strip to my flange strip. It's pretty long, so I did take and just wrap the to bring it back over to my sewing area. I just wrapped it around one of my rulers to keep it nice and manageable while I go ahead and press this. So what I'm going to do is still set my seam. You always want to set your seam letting that thread drop into your fabric, and then I'm going to press it towards the binding strip, which is the skinnier strip. Alright, so I'm going to keep doing that, being careful to make sure that I'm keeping this nice and straight as I press it, because it can get distorted very easily, which is why I finger press and then press, and I only unroll a manageable amount first. Alright, so I've completed pressing towards my binding strip. Remember, the flange is the larger strip, the binding is the smaller strip. I've pressed completely towards the binding strip. Now I have one more press to do, and that is to now fold my strip in half, lining up my edges of my binding with the flange edge, which will leave about 1/4 of an inch of the flange, the peekaboo, showing. I'm going to go ahead and continue doing this for the whole length of the binding. As I finish pressing this, I'm going to go ahead and wind it onto my bobbin baby. But in order to do that, for this to work out as you need to put it on, you need to make sure that when you are winding it onto the bobbin baby, that the flange is closest to you and that you can see it. So you have the peekaboo flange, the flange is towards me to wind it on. And the reason for that is that we have to have the other end of this to start our quilt. It does matter in this case which end you use to start with. Alright, so I'm just going to go ahead and wind that on as I go. Alright, I have my binding strip all on my poor binding baby. She looks like a mummy. I kept this especially loose just because of the 2 pieces of fabric, and the seam. It made it a little more bulky, so my poor binding baby looks like a little mummy. But anyhow, so I want to make sure that I have my strip, my starting strip, with, when I'm holding it with the flange towards me, I have my edge of my binding. And what I want to do is I want to stitch it onto the back of the quilt with 1/4 of an inch. Very similar to how you would put on your normal binding, except for we're going to apply it to the back. Just a tip that I like to do is that I know for about 40 inches in, I have a seam. And in this case, I have 2 seams, which I did offset a bit when I put them together. But still, there's some bulk there. And I really don't want that ending up at my corner. So I traditionally, it's not fail-proof because I have 3 other corners to hit, but I typically start about 20 inches out from my corner. For 2 reasons. I know that at least my first corner won't have a seam because I have to go 40 inches to get to a seam. 2, I right away knock out a corner, which I think I'm not alone in that it gives me angst when I go ahead and do it. But I'm going to repeat the tips that I showed you in the earlier weeks on how I handle the corners, and hopefully it will help you as well. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take off typically about, I'm going to start sewing about 20 inches away. I want to leave, a good, 6 to 8 inches unsewn above that to help me work my my magic, if you would, when I get back to finishing this off. So I typically just go ahead and do a few pins here just to keep it, actually I'm doing wonder clips. I love them. Just to keep me straight until I get to the corner. Keep them in my little glass jar. Anyhow, right, anything with color, I just love just looking at it. It looks great sitting on the shelf. Anyhow, so I'm going to move this over to my sewing machine. I can carry my bobbin baby, and I will start over there. I've gone ahead and placed my bobbin baby on the spare hook of my thread spool on my machine so that she can sit there and hold everything nice and organized. Alright, so I have my starting edge loose up here. I'm starting in about 20 inches from my corner and leaving about 8 inches exposed. I'm going to go ahead and put my foot down and my needle down, and I'm going to start with a locked in seam. I'm going to stitch this with a 1/4 inch. So I'm going to make sure I keep a nice and even 1/4 inch with my binding strips lined up against the edge. I have my flange on the top of the back of my quilt. So I'm going to keep stitching until I get to the corner. Alright, so I'm about at the corner of my quilt, and similar to what I showed you on week 13, I'm going to go ahead and mark a 1/4 inch before I get to my corner. Now my foot has a marking on it, but I personally just like to see the line, right? And therefore I'm going to go ahead and stitch down to that line. So I'm just taking it nice and slow. Don't be afraid to lift up your foot if you need to. My 1/4 inch foot doesn't give me the view as much as I'd like. So therefore I keep my needle down always, and I can just press my foot up to see. Now here I personally like to take 1 or 2 stitches back, and then I come 1 or 2 stitches forward. Now I'm going to turn it and stitch to the corner. So I put my foot down. I've lined up my corner in my vision line, and I'm just going to come straight at it. All right. Yes, I know I'm old school. I'm now going to finger press this corner. Let me see if I can get this in here. I'm going to use my corsage pin, similar to how I did in my week 13 for my normal binding. So I'm going to bring this back at a 45-degree angle and give it a good press. You'll see here how I stitched down and then I shot over for my 1/4 inch, right, pivoting that corner. Just locks it in a little tighter. I know some people will stop, but I like to, stitch and then come to the corner. All right. Next, I'm going to flip this back, and I like to stick in my corsage pin, which is just a heavier gauge pin than my Quilter's Fine. And then using the corsage pin, I try and make sure that this is as straight as possible. And then I also want to make sure that I'm not cutting this too tight, this fold, or leaving too much extra. Both of those will cause me agita later. All right. Then using my thumb, I just kind of feel for that seam. and I stick one of my needles in there so that I can just call it out. I know some people will come in here and start and go ahead and stitch this all the way through. I like to come in about 3/8 in, do my knot, and then back stitch gradually, not all the way to the end, but just a few stitches back, and then come forward. So let me just show you that. So just eyeballing. I always bring my foot down, you know, by itself, making sure I'm clear of that needle or that pin. And then I bring my needle down manually, just to make sure if I mistakenly am too close to the pin, I can see it and stop. Alright, so now I'm just going to knot. My machine takes about a step back when it knots. So I'm going to go ahead now and remove the pin. And I do think that I could go back one more step. So I'm just going to engage my back stitch and do a full stitch back there. And then come forward. And then since I've passed that first corner, now I like to personally put my gloves on to help me with that, you know, just managing everything here with the fabric. You know, the quilt, it's a little bulky, and I go ahead and put back in some of my wonder clips, lining that up, keeping that, you know, not too taut, but I don't want it to be too loosey-goosey either. And the gloves just help me kind of grip the quilt, and in my mind just makes it a little bit more manageable. Alright, so I'm going to go ahead and finish this off. And then I'll show you the final connection. Alright, I've come to about 12 inches from my start. And I have put double wonder clips. That lets me know, stop. So I'm going to go ahead, I can remove one of these now. I'm just going to stitch up, you know, near the one. Doesn't need to be exact. Alright, so now I'm going to put my knot stitch. And now I'm going to take this over to the ironing station to go ahead and prep my connection. Okay, so similar to what I did on week 13, I've brought my quilt over to my ironing station, including my little bobbin baby. See, she just has a little bit left on her. I am going to take the original, you know, my start, and bring that over and fold that back, leaving a little bit. And then I'm going to do the same with this side. I usually like to give it a little press. And I basically want it to have about 1/8 to 1/4 of an inch shortage when I fold it back. And the reason for that is because this is not as tight as it would be when I would stitch it all the way together. So that's why we leave the little gap. And then I'm just going to check it. Right, so I'm just making sure mine's just a smidge smaller than 1/4 of an inch. Alright, the next thing that I want to do is I'm going to draw 2 lines, and they are going to be the width of my strip, right, apart. So when I had pieced my 2 strips together, they ended up being 2 7/8 wide once I've sewed my 1/4 inch seam in and pressed. So here I'm going to go ahead and mark I don't have much left on this side, so I usually try and about split the difference. Doesn't really matter because it's all loose. So I'm going to go there, and then I'm going 2 7/8 away from that line. Right, so that would be my 3. So I'm backing off 1. And I'm going to go ahead and draw my second line. I can go ahead and remove that clip now and get in there. Alright, then I just take my normal scissors and I'm going to, I'm using my nippers, but you get the idea, and make those cuts. Alright, so I can put my little bobbin baby to bed over here. Alright, now I like to take a binding clip basically to hold this a little tighter. But first I'm going to do my matching. Right, so I now have my 2 strips and I'm going to put them together on the diagonal. Similar to how we attached our strips together, our small strips together to create our long binding strip. So I just go ahead and do that. You could do this with pins as well. So pins or wonder clips would work fine. I'm basically going to stitch across here, so I'll probably have to play with these a bit when I get there. And then my little binder trick is I just do this to hold my quilt a little a little closer, so that I'm able to do this stitching without worrying that my quilt is constantly pulling at me. Alright, let me go stitch this. Alright, so you can basically see I drew my line with my overlap and did my stitching. Now I'm going to cut about 1/4 inch off of that seam. And I'm going to press that open. I like to bring out my big stick. I'm going to go ahead and unclip that now. Set my seam. Get a little steam. Alright, and then I'm just going to fold it back, head back to the machine, and go ahead and stitch this binding the rest of the way on. Alright, so I went back and I stitched that in, and now when I turn this over, you can see that by doing that 45-degree connection, you can't really see it. I mean, I can see it if I look really closely, but it came together really nicely. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go around the quilt and press, basically set my seam and then press my binding away from the back. Alright? Because I'm going to be pulling it to the front and then stitching down my right in the ditch between my flange and my binding, and I'll show you that just in a bit. Alright, I've gone ahead and I've pressed back the entire binding from the back of my quilt using my iron, and in the corner I've gone ahead and just stuck the nose of my iron in there to create that little cave, if you would. So there's 3 major differences when we are sewing on a flange binding or a false flange binding. Basically, we're adhering it to the back of the quilt, and then we need to prep our corners, and then we're going to stitch it down from the front. So there's several others, but those are the real biggies. Alright, so when I say we have to prep our corner, is that we need to prepare it so that when we're sewing from the front, that it's ready to go for us. And you really want to do the fold the opposite of what you have here, so that you've basically evened out the bulk there for when your machine comes through. So I'm going to go ahead and fold this back. Now, basically, where my binding meets my flange is what should be lining up with my stitch line, right? So I'm going to go ahead and kind of eyeball that there. And I just come in with an iron. I give it a little steam. Alright, I'll let that cool a little bit because it's a little ouchy. And then I'm going to take this side and fold it back the same way, basically lining up where that seam line is, where my binding meets my flange, and lining that up with the stitch line on this side. Alright, then I come back to my trusty little corsage pin, and I basically just use that to make sure I'm keeping that nice and straight. And then I come in again with my iron, give it a good steam. If you wanted to, you could give it a little bit of a hit of best press. Just make sure to dry it. You never want to be stitching on wet fabric. Alright, and now I can go ahead and take some more of my wander clips and just clip that so it's ready. Alright, now I'm going to turn around to the front. Alright, and you ideally really want to either go ahead and set your binding clips, you know, for a good stretch, so that you can kind of just remove them as you go. You could also press it. Turn that around, sorry. If you wanted to. I usually find that just using my binding, my wander clips gives me enough support to keep this where it should be. Alright, so you're just kind of eyeballing it. So you want to prepare it at least, you know, a side or two at a time. So if you only do two sides, you will have to stop stitching and prepare your other two. So I typically, you know, I keep a full jar of my little wander clips, and they allow me to go ahead and prep the whole thing. So I'm going to do that and then take you over to the sewing machine to see how we stitch this down. So I've come over to my sewing machine, and you know me, I'm going to start about 20 inches from a corner because I want to tackle that corner first. I'm going to do a couple things. I want to make sure that my bobbin thread matches the back of my quilt. Then I want to pick a thread that will match my flange. Alright, and if you don't have exact, try and go a shade or two lighter, but this should work perfect. I love it. It gives me an opportunity to use some of these colored aurifil threads that I picked up, because I typically sew with basically 4 threads when I'm piecing. I don't go into matching colors, so this gives me an opportunity to use that. The other thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to switch my foot. I sew on a pfaff, and it has a stitch in the ditch foot. And it basically has a little guide here that's going to go down and stitch, allow me to stay and ride that stitch line, basically that ditch that's formed by my binding and flange. Some people, and again it's a matter of preference, it's your quilt, I've noticed actually stitch on the flange, and you're really supposed to have the flange that's really not attached. So you really want to come in and stitch in the ditch where your binding meets your flange. And if you fold it properly, right, and that's why I have all these little wonder clips keeping me on track, that I've lined up my binding where it ends, where that seam is right where I stitched it on the back. All right. So between that poofiness or, you know, thickness, my foot will, with this guide, help keep me on target, because I want to be stitching just a few threads into the flange. All right, so let me thread my machine and show you how that might work for you. Okay, so I've changed out my top thread to match my flange. I have my bobbin matching or blending with my background. I went with, because mine's, you know, floral, I just went with my typical light ivory in the bottom. I am going to start about 20 inches up from the corner, just because I like to get to that corner right away and get the stress out. All right, I'm going to come in here. I did put my gloves back on. I just find it helps me to move this, because if the quilt wasn't heavy enough to begin with, once I've added all these little wonder clips, it got a little heavy. So the gloves, the grippies on the gloves help me move the fabric, but yet keep me agile enough to do what I need to do. All right, so I am going to try and keep this as straight as possible, and I'm going to bring my foot down to make sure that, in my case, because I'm using an in the ditch foot, that the guide is riding right up against my binding, where my binding meets my flange. All right, if you don't have one of those feet, I'd recommend possibly getting one of the feet where you can move over your needle. Apologies, I don't know the name of this foot. It's a 0 foot on my machine, but basically you can move this screw over and it will move your plastic guide over, and that might be something that could help you stay on track. All right, but if you have a stitch in the ditch foot, again, it might be worth the investment depending on how often you do this, or if you quilt your quilt in the ditch on your domestic machine. All right, next I'm going to bring down my needle and I'm going to tie a knot. All right, good to go. I do keep my stitch length here around 2.5. You don't want to get it too tight. We got a decent amount of bulk here. I am going to remove my wonder clips as I go. I typically sew up a little closer to it than that. Take your time. Think about all the time you are saving from hand stitching this, and just take your time. I cannot stress that enough. All right, so I get a little close. I go ahead and remove this. Just taking my time. It's not a race. It's already going to help me get it done a lot quicker than I would have. I kind of have to futz here a bit. All right. Keep going. I'm going to go right down into that corner, and you can see here how we needed to prepare it ahead of time, because the fold is the opposite direction that we're sewing in. If I went ahead and sewed this down and then brought this over and came around, it would be extremely bulky on one side. This way, it's the opposite of the fold on this side, and it isn't as bulky. All right, so I'm going to come right on in to that corner. So again, don't be afraid keeping your needle down to bring up your foot a little and do a little peekaboo. It looks like I can do one more stitch. All right, and now I'm going to turn it. So needle down, and I'm going to have to take this pin out, or this wonder clip out. You could do this with pins as well, but I find myself sticking myself, so I find that the wonder clips work best for me. All right, now I'm going to go ahead and put my needle down, or my foot down, and then continue on this journey around the quilt. And you'll notice here that my stitching is right in there. It's right up against it. So technically I still have a flange. And here my stitching is just outside my binding, but not noticeable to the normal person. All right, I'm going to keep stitching this, and I'll show you when I get to the end. All right, I'm almost at the place that I started at, and I'm going to handle it the same exact way. I'm going to keep going in the ditch here. And then when I get to the place I started, I go a couple stitches beyond, and then I'm going to do my knot. And bring my needle up, cut my threads, and then I will go over and trim these up a bit. And that's it. Really simple. So there you have it. It's finished. Quite a lot easier than sewing it on by hand. I find it extremely useful. It has its place. It is something that is doable. Again, it's not going to be something you can do in a half hour. At least I can't. But it is something that is much quicker than sewing it on by hand, and I think you will find it is much stronger for those quilts that you're going to wash a lot. The one thing I forgot to mention at the beginning was one of my favorite tools when I'm putting on binding was my binding baby. So I didn't want her to be left out. So she works fabulously. So that's it for week 15. We're going to talk through another binding technique next week on week 16. But I hope you will follow me on Facebook, Instagram, as well as on YouTube for these fabulous tips and tricks that I share with you on most Tuesdays in my Tutorial Tuesday series. Thank you again. I'm Renee Hiatt, and I hope to see you soon.